The night was quiet, almost too quiet, as I sat by Jake's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. The room was dark, save for a small lamp casting a warm, muted glow across the bed, illuminating his pale face. It pained me to see him like this, frail, fragile, his once vibrant spirit reduced to silent endurance. I'd done everything I could think of, everything the doctor suggested, every alternative treatment, but nothing seemed to help. And his condition only worsened by the day. Desperation had become my constant companion. Every hour felt like sand slipping through my fingers, each minute closer to the moment I feared most. I found myself spending long hours online, scouring forums and medical sites, hoping for a miracle, some breakthrough, something that could save him. But night after night, my search turned up nothing but empty promises and dead ends. Then, one evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of my computer screen, a message popped up, interrupting my scrolling. At first, I assumed it was spam or one of those scams preying on the desperate, but the subject line caught my attention. For those seeking hope beyond hope. Against my better judgment, I opened it, expecting to delete it as soon as I saw the contents. Instead, I found myself frozen, staring at the message. The email was brief, no more than a few sentences, but each word felt like it was written specifically for me. It spoke of rituals that could bring back the lost, of methods passed down through shadowy circles. There were vague references to sacrifices and borrowed time, phrases that should have alarmed me, made me close the email and forget it ever existed. But the last line gripped me. For those who would give anything to save a loved one, follow these steps carefully. My heart hammered in my chest as I read the instructions. They were simple enough, oddly straightforward. Candles, a few of Jake's personal items, symbols I had to draw around the bed. It sounded ridiculous, almost too simple. But in that moment, staring at Jake's face, pale and still, I felt a dark curiosity stir within me. If there was even a slim chance this ritual could work, how could I not try it? The decision gnawed at me as the days passed. I continued with my usual routines, talking to doctors, caring for Jake, pretending that everything was normal, but the instructions from that email were a shadow in my mind, following me, whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was the answer. I avoided mentioning the email to anyone, even my closest friends. I could already imagine their reactions, the mixture of concern and disbelief, and deep down I feared they might be right. It was absurd. Borderline insane, really. But that voice kept whispering. The one that reminded me of every moment I'd spent with Jake, every memory, and every fear of losing him. One night, when the weight of helplessness felt too heavy to bear, I gave in. I waited until the world outside was silent, until the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. I gathered the items, lighting the candles one by one, their flames casting flickering shadows across the room. My hands shook as I arranged the objects. Jake's favorite book, a watch he wore every day, a photograph of us smiling in better times. Then, with a steadying breath, I drew the symbols around the bed as instructed, feeling a chill settle in the air as I completed each one. As I finished, an overwhelming silence filled the room. The usual creaks and groans of the house had faded, leaving only the soft crackle of candle flames. I stood there, my heart pounding, staring down at Jake, waiting for something, anything to happen. For a long moment, nothing did. I felt foolish, humiliated by my own desperation, ready to blow out the candles and forget I'd ever tried this ridiculous ritual. But then, as if sensing my surrender, Jake shifted in his sleep, his breathing deepening, his face relaxing in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but my heart leapt. I leaned over him, watching as his face took on a hint of color, the shallow pallor lifting just enough to make me believe that maybe, just maybe, he was coming back to me. I stayed by his side, clutching his hand, waiting for him to wake, though he never did. Still, I felt a glimmer of hope return, like a faint light in the darkness, whispering that I'd made the right choice, that somehow I'd done something to help him. The next morning, I woke to find Jake sitting up in bed, his eyes open and alert for the first time in weeks. He looked at me, a faint, almost puzzled smile on his face. "Hey!" he whispered, his voice weak but alive. The sight of him awake and aware sent a wave of relief crashing over me, and I sank down next to him, clutching his hand, tears prickling in my eyes. "You're here," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid that if I spoke too loudly, I might break the fragile reality of this moment. For the next few days, Jake's recovery seemed almost miraculous. He was eating again, his voice stronger, his energy returning little by little. Friends and family visited, expressing joy at his sudden turnaround, though none of them could explain it. His doctors were baffled, muttering about unexpected responses to medication and the body's mysterious capacity for healing. But I knew the truth, or at least I thought I did. Despite my joy, an uneasiness settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to push it away, convincing myself it was just residual fear, a leftover from the long, dark days of his illness. But strange things started happening around the house. At first, they were small, a chill in the air, shadows that seemed to stretch longer than usual, whispers just on the edge of hearing. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. After all, I hadn't told anyone about the ritual, and Jake's recovery could just as easily be a stroke of luck. But the feeling grew harder to ignore. I'd wake in the middle of the night, the room eerily silent, Jake breathing beside me, and feel a presence watching us. I would lie there, heart pounding, straining to catch any sound, but all I'd hear were soft murmurs, like voices carried on a far-off wind. One night, I saw a dark shape reflected in the bedroom mirror, tall, indistinct, like a shadow with no source. I blinked and it was gone, but the image stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Desperate to distract myself, I began searching for answers, hoping to find some logical explanation for these occurrences. I revisited the email, combing through it for clues I might have missed. The more I read, the more ominous it seemed, as if the words themselves held a hidden meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I noticed phrases like borrowed time and reclaiming the debt that had slipped by in my initial reading, words that now filled me with a growing dread. As the days passed, the disturbances only intensified. Lights would flicker, sudden drafts would sweep through the house, and I'd find objects in places I hadn't left them. One evening, while I was cooking, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. When I turned around, no one was there. But the feeling lingered, thick and suffocating, like a presence that I couldn't shake off. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old forum thread buried deep in an online archive that I began to piece together the horrific truth. The thread discussed a cult, a group that believed in exchanging life for life, a practice they called temporal displacement. According to the scattered posts, the ritual I had performed wasn't a cure, but a trade. It allowed the recipient to live, but only by stealing time from another. I read on, my heart pounding, as I learned that people who had performed this ritual reported similar disturbances, manifestations that they could never explain or escape. The weight of my actions settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I'd saved Jake, but at what cost? If this was true, if his life was now tied to some borrowed time, then someone else, someone out there, was suffering in his place. Or worse, perhaps this time came from multiple lives, innocent people whose fates I'd bound to my desperate act. That night, I couldn't bring myself to look at Jake. Every time he spoke, every time he laughed, the thought haunted me. How much of his life was his own? How much had I taken from others, unknowingly, in my desire to save him? As the days wore on, I felt trapped in my own guilt, haunted by every sound, every flicker of shadow that hinted at what I'd done. Jake's health was stable, even vibrant, and he seemed blissfully unaware of the dread gnawing at me. He would laugh, tell stories, and make plans for the future as if nothing had ever been wrong. But I couldn't share his joy, couldn't shake the feeling that we were living on borrowed time, that each moment was a fragile, stolen thing. One night, unable to sleep, I crept down to the living room and opened my laptop. I was determined to find a way to reverse the ritual, to return whatever time I had stolen. I read through thread after thread, digging through every bit of information I could find, desperate for any hint of redemption. But all I found were warnings, stories of people who'd tried to break the pact, tales of lives ending in mysterious accidents, of people haunted by relentless shadows and voices until they vanished entirely. The stories filled me with dread, but I couldn't accept that there was no way out. I found one final forum, a post buried at the bottom of a page, written by someone who claimed to have ended the ritual's hold. They spoke of a final rite, a way to balance the scales. I followed the instructions carefully, my hands shaking as I read. It would require a personal sacrifice, something of mine given freely in place of the time I'd taken. I gathered what I needed, a piece of jewelry from my grandmother, a small locket that I'd worn since I was a child. The rite demanded a precious possession, something that held a piece of my soul. I stood over Jake, his face peaceful in sleep, and whispered words I'd never spoken before. Words from that final post. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching and shifting as I offered up the locket, feeling it almost pulse in my hand as if it carried a part of me. For a moment, the house fell silent. The shadows withdrew and I thought I'd succeeded. But then the whispers returned, louder this time, filling my head with a chorus of voices, each one a life I'd disturbed, each one a debt that couldn't be repaid so easily. The darkness around me thickened and I saw the shapes again, flickering, closing in. I clutched the locket tighter, feeling a chill seep into my bones, realizing with horror that my sacrifice had only drawn them closer. Then Jake stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at me, and in that moment I saw something shift in his gaze, a glint of recognition, almost otherworldly. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice tinged with a sadness that chilled me. I stepped back, heart pounding, as he sat up, the shadows around us seeming to cling to him like a second skin. I tried to speak, to explain, but words failed me. He looked around, taking in the room, the lingering shadows, the locket in my hand. "I knew," he murmured, almost to himself. "Somehow, I knew you did something to bring me back." Tears filled my eyes as I realized he understood the terrible choice I'd made. "I couldn't let you go," I choked out, feeling the weight of every decision crash down on me. He reached out, his hand covering mine over the locket, and for a moment, his touch was warm, grounding. But then his expression hardened, and he gently pushed my hand away, setting the locket aside. "Some things aren't meant to be changed, Alyssa. I think my time is already up." His words were barely a whisper, but they echoed through the room, filling the silence that followed. I reached for him, desperation clawing at me, but he shook his head, giving me a look of sad understanding. Slowly, he lay back down, his face serene as his breathing began to slow, each breath softer than the last. I held his hand, feeling his warmth fading, until the room grew still and he was gone. The shadows receded, the voices quieted, and I was left alone in the silence, the finality of my actions settling over me. I sat there in the dim light, clutching the empty locket, knowing that I'd tried to defy fate and lost. The night was colder than usual, with a sharp wind that bit into my skin and reminded me of just how exposed I was. After years of drifting through the streets, I had grown used to the cold, but tonight felt different, sharper somehow, as if the air itself was warning me of something. I wandered down an empty street, my hands jammed deep in my coat pockets, searching for a place to hide from the biting wind. That's when I saw it. A tall, looming building with broken windows and an eerie stillness about it. The complex looked abandoned, the kind of place people would avoid, but to me, it was an opportunity. A roof over my head, maybe even a place to call my own for a while. The streetlight cast a faint, sickly glow over the building's worn facade, highlighting the cracks in the walls and the graffiti scrawled across its doors. I felt a strange pull toward it, an instinct I couldn't ignore. With a glance over my shoulder to make sure no one was watching, I approached the entrance, which was barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the smell of mold and dust hitting me instantly. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and silent, with only the faintest hum of air seeping through broken windows. I hesitated, feeling a shiver crawl up my spine, but the thought of sleeping under a real roof, even one as decrepit as this, was too tempting to pass up. I wandered the halls, finally settling on a small apartment on the second floor. Most of the furniture was gone and the walls were peeling, but there was a mattress on the floor which felt like a luxury compared to the cold concrete I'd grown used to. I set my pack down, took off my shoes, and lay on the mattress, listening to the silence. It was so still, unnaturally so, as if the entire building was holding its breath. I drifted into a shallow sleep, but was awakened sometime in the early hours by a soft creaking sound. My eyes opened to darkness, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, a faint, almost rhythmic creak coming from somewhere down the hall. I sat up listening, my heart beating faster. It was probably nothing, I told myself, just the old building settling. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and willing myself back to sleep. But the noise persisted, growing slightly louder as if something was moving closer, step by step. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe, straining to hear past the pounding of my heart. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, thick and stifling, pressing down on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I lay back down, but sleep was elusive. My mind raced, replaying the sound over and over, searching for an explanation that made sense. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, some raccoon or stray dog wandering through the halls. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. By morning, the feeling had faded, replaced by the bright light streaming through the broken windows. I got up, shook off the uneasy memories of the night, and wandered outside to scavenge for food. But even as I walked through the bustling streets, I felt the weight of the night lingering over me, a reminder that whatever comfort the apartment offered came with a cost I didn't yet understand. That night, I returned to the apartment building with a few scraps of food I'd managed to gather from a nearby dumpster. The sky was darkening fast, clouds rolling in thick and heavy, casting long shadows across the street. As I stepped back inside, the stale air wrapped around me, carrying that same smell of decay and something else I still couldn't identify. The hallway seemed even darker than the night before, each step echoing down the corridor as if the walls were absorbing and amplifying every sound. I climbed the stairs, and as I reached the second floor, I noticed something strange. A door halfway down the hall was slightly ajar. It hadn't been open when I'd passed earlier, and I hadn't seen any signs of other people. I approached it slowly, peering inside, but the room was empty, save for the faint smell of mildew. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had pushed it open, and continued to my little corner in the apartment I'd claimed. But that unease from the night before had returned, heavier this time, as if the air itself was watching me, waiting. I lay down on the mattress, pulling my coat tighter around me for warmth, and closed my eyes. The quiet settled over me, deep and stifling, and I tried to steady my breathing. But soon enough, the noises began again. This time, it wasn't just a soft creaking. There was something else, faint at first, a whispering sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves, slipping into the silence like an intruder. I sat up, my pulse quickening, listening to the faint voices. They were distant, almost too low to make out, but I could hear them weaving through the building, growing louder, as if moving closer with each passing second. The whispers didn't make sense. Disjointed phrases, names, words that felt cold and empty. I strained to hear, trying to catch a coherent word, but all I could make out was a single chilling word. Leave. A shiver ran down my spine, and I hugged my knees, trying to shake the feeling that the building was alive, pulsing with a dark energy I didn't understand. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the product of too many lonely nights and empty streets. But the whispers continued, louder and clearer, growing into an almost painful hum that filled the room. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep through, like it was echoing inside my head. After what felt like hours, the noise faded, leaving me in a silence that felt even more sinister than the whispers. I sat there, shaking, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe too loudly. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get as far from this place as I could, but part of me resisted. The building had become a strange, twisted sanctuary for me, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. The next day, I spent hours wandering the empty corridors, trying to shake off the memory of the night before. As I moved through the complex, I found signs that I hadn't been alone. Footprints in the dust, faint marks on the walls that hadn't been there before. I told myself they were probably mine, evidence of my own movements, but something about them felt wrong. The footprints were deeper, larger, like they belonged to something heavier, something that didn't belong in a place meant for people. The thought lingered with me as the day wore on. Every corner I turned, every room I entered felt shadowed by something unseen, something lurking just beyond my line of sight. By nightfall, I was back in my little room, exhausted but too wired to sleep. I sat on the mattress, watching the flickering shadows cast by the streetlight outside, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something here, something old and angry, and it was watching me. I barely slept that night, lying on the mattress in complete darkness, listening to the creaks and murmurs that seemed to swell around me. My instincts screamed that I should leave, but some stubborn part of me wouldn't let go of the only place that felt like shelter, however twisted it had become. Just before dawn, exhaustion claimed me, pulling me into a fitful sleep, my mind churning with nightmares of faceless figures lurking in the shadows. I awoke with a start to the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. They weren't like the light, creaking sounds I'd heard before. These were slow, deliberate, each step landing with a weight that seemed to make the floor tremble. I sat up, barely daring to breathe, listening as the footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside my door. My heart pounded as I watched the door, terrified that it might swing open. Seconds passed in agonizing silence, and then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate the very walls. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, frozen in place as the growl grew louder, filling the room like a suffocating fog. I could feel it, a presence just beyond the door, something inhuman, ancient, and filled with a malevolence that radiated through the air. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that somehow felt even more terrifying. I stayed still, waiting, hoping that whatever was out there would pass by. But then the doorknob rattled. Slowly, it turned, and the door creaked open just a sliver, enough for me to glimpse something beyond, a shadow that moved on its own, twisting and stretching as if it were alive. Panic surged through me, and I leapt up, bolting out of the room. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the silence, chased by the growing sound of heavy footsteps behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing as I tried to remember the layout of the building, praying I could find a way out before whatever was behind me caught up. The hallways twisted and stretched, seeming to shift as I ran, turning me around until I barely knew where I was. Doors appeared and vanished, rooms I'd never seen before opening up in the corners of my vision, dark and gaping as if inviting me in. The building felt alive, like it was hurting me, leading me into some unseen trap. I finally stumbled upon a stairwell and scrambled down, taking the steps two at a time, barely managing to keep my balance. As I reached the bottom, I caught a glimpse of something in the shadows at the top of the stairs. A figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed in the darkness, watching me with a hunger that sent chills through my veins. I burst out into the lobby, my feet skidding on the dusty floor as I made a break for the entrance. The air around me felt thick, like something was pushing back, trying to keep me inside. But I forced myself to keep going, every step a struggle against the invisible weight pressing down on me. Finally, I reached the door, throwing it open and stumbling into the cold night air. I ran down the empty street, not daring to look back until I was a safe distance away. When I finally stopped and turned, the building stood silent and dark, just as it had when I'd first seen it. But in one of the upper windows, I could make out a shape, a shadow that moved slowly back and forth, watching me with a cold intensity that felt almost palpable. I never went back, but the experience haunted me. At night, I'd sometimes wake up to the faint echo of footsteps, or catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved on its own, following me, as if whatever was in that building had marked me, bound to me by the fear I'd felt within those walls. The night was darker than usual, with a thick fog hanging low over the quiet, winding road. I checked the address on the pizza box again, squinting at the small screen of my phone to make sure I was in the right place. The GPS had led me down a road I'd never been on before, far from the neighborhoods I was used to delivering in. Out here, there were no streetlights, no other houses nearby, just a single, lonely building standing at the end of the road. I pulled up in front of the house, a large, crumbling structure with peeling paint and windows that stared back at me like empty eyes. The place looked abandoned, though the porch light flickered on and off, as if fighting to stay lit. For a second, I hesitated, glancing around to see if there were any other signs of life, but everything was still and silent, with only the soft rustling of leaves in the trees around the property. I stepped out of the car, pizza box in hand, feeling an eerie sense of quiet settle over me as I approached the porch. Each step felt louder than it should, the crunch of gravel under my feet echoing in the empty night. I kept telling myself it was just another delivery, but the atmosphere around the place was thick, heavy in a way I couldn't quite explain. I forced myself to walk up the steps and knocked on the door, listening for any movement inside. Nothing. Just silence. I knocked again, a little louder this time, calling out, "Pizza delivery." My voice sounded small in the vast emptiness around me, and for a moment I wondered if this was some kind of prank. Maybe someone had ordered a pizza to an abandoned house just to mess with me. But then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound from the other side of the door, as if someone was there, hesitating just out of sight. I leaned in, straining to listen, and sure enough I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone was walking toward the door. I waited, expecting the door to open, my hand tightening around the pizza box. But the footsteps stopped suddenly, just on the other side. I waited, holding my breath, but there was no further sound, no movement, no sign of anyone coming to greet me. After a few more seconds, I knocked one last time, louder, hoping to stir whoever was inside. The silence that followed was so deep it felt unnatural, pressing down on me, filling me with an odd sense of dread. I glanced around the porch, considering just leaving the pizza and walking away, but something kept me rooted there, an inexplicable feeling that I needed to see who or what was behind that door. When no one answered, I took a step back, ready to give up. But as I turned to head back to my car, a movement caught my eye, something standing at the corner of the house. I froze, my heart thudding as I squinted through the dim light. A man was standing there, half hidden in the shadows, just watching me. He was tall, his posture unnaturally still, his face obscured by darkness, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me, cold and unblinking. A chill ran down my spine, and I fought the urge to back away, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke him. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring in a way that made every instinct in my body scream to get out of there. I forced myself to breathe, tearing my gaze away from the shadowy figure by the side of the house. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe he was just some guy, a neighbor, or the homeowner himself, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. He hadn't called out to me, hadn't acknowledged me in any way. He was just watching, like some kind of predator sizing up its prey. My hands shook as I tightened my grip on the pizza box, glancing back at the door one last time, hoping someone, anyone, would come to explain what was going on. But the house remained silent and still, as if it had been empty for years. All I could hear was the faint hum of the flickering porch light and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, I decided enough was enough. Whatever was going on here, I wanted no part of it. I took a step back, my heart racing as I turned to head back down the steps, keeping the man in my peripheral vision. He hadn't moved an inch. His figure was unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on me, like he was daring me to leave. As I reached the gravel driveway, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I turned my head, half expecting to see the man following me. But when I looked back, the porch was empty, the door closed, the shadows quiet and undisturbed. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I turned, like whoever, or whatever, was inside, didn't want to be seen. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickened my pace, forcing myself to look straight ahead. But the closer I got to my car, the more I felt that presence behind me, like invisible eyes boring into my back. I fought the urge to run, afraid that if I did, it might provoke something. Instead, I focused on keeping my footsteps steady, my breaths quiet, as if staying calm would somehow keep me safe. Just as I reached the car door, I glanced back over my shoulder. The man was gone. The spot by the side of the house where he'd stood was empty, as if he'd vanished into thin air. For a moment, I let out a breath of relief, thinking it was finally over. But then, just as I was about to get in, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows. His posture was the same, unnervingly still, his face lost in darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and focused. I yanked the car door open, my hands trembling as I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. My fingers fumbled as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life as I stole another glance toward the trees. He hadn't moved, but his gaze followed me, tracking my every movement with a quiet intensity that felt almost suffocating. As I shifted into drive, I floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning against the gravel before I lurched forward. I didn't look back, my eyes locked on the road as I sped down the dark, winding path. But even as I left the house behind, that eerie, watching presence lingered, settling over me like a cold fog that refused to lift. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just experienced. Had it been a prank, some twisted joke set up to scare delivery drivers? But the man's expression, his stillness, the silence of that house, it didn't feel like a prank. It felt real, like I'd stepped into a place I was never supposed to see. A hidden world that lay dormant until I stumbled upon it. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and dark, with only my headlights cutting through the thick fog. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could still feel that man's eyes on me, as if he were sitting right behind me, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting. After a few minutes, I forced myself to breathe, to calm down. It's over, I told myself. I was miles away from that house now, surrounded by nothing but open road and the occasional distant farmhouse. But that sense of dread lingered, sticking to me like a shadow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there in the middle of the road, watching me from afar. When I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town, I pulled in, needing a moment to gather myself. I parked under the bright lights by the pumps, feeling a strange sense of relief in the glow. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty lot, trying to shake off the nightmarish feeling that had clung to me ever since I'd pulled up to that house. I was about to turn off the engine when I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. A shadow in the back seat, barely visible, but there. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, every muscle in my body locking up. The shadow was still, silent, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare into the rearview mirror, watching that dark shape lurking behind me. A sharp knock on my window shattered the silence, and I jumped, my heart nearly pounding out of my chest. I turned, my gaze locking onto the gas station clerk, who looked at me with a concerned expression. I forced a weak smile, rolling down the window just enough to hear him. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but warm. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just long night." He gave me a strange look, but nodded, stepping back to let me be. I watched him walk back to the station, a small part of me relieved that I wasn't completely alone. I glanced back at the rearview mirror, and the shadow was gone. Nothing but empty seats stared back at me. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me after the scare I'd had. I pulled out of the gas station, eager to put as much distance between myself and that house as possible. But as I drove, the memory of that figure by the house stayed with me, creeping into my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch and shift, taking on that same unnerving stillness, that silent, unblinking watchfulness. By the time I made it home, I felt completely drained. I parked and stumbled out of the car, glancing around my driveway, half expecting to see him again, standing there in the shadows. But everything was quiet, the familiar glow of the porch light a welcome sight. Inside, I locked the door and sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. I'd been through a lot of strange deliveries, seen my share of weirdness on the job, but nothing like this. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible, something I still didn't fully understand. My mind kept replaying the sound of those heavy footsteps, the silence of the house, and that man's unblinking stare. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house, every shift of shadows outside my window made my heart race. And just as I was finally drifting off, a soft sound reached my ears. A faint knock, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. It echoed through the quiet of my room, filling me with that same icy dread I'd felt on that porch. I didn't dare get up. I lay there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the knock didn't come again. All that was left was the haunting memory of that dark, empty stare, a reminder of something that had seen me, and maybe hadn't quite let go. The rain drummed steadily on the metal roof of the warehouse, each drop a muted beat against the stillness of the night. I had grown used to the sound by now. In fact, I found it comforting. It masked the silence that filled every corner of this massive, empty building, keeping my mind from wandering too far into dark places. Working the night shift as a security guard was mostly quiet and uneventful, which was fine by me. The pay was decent, and all I had to do was check the cameras, walk the rounds, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the rain, heavier than usual, or the low fog that clung to the ground, making everything outside the warehouse look like it was trapped in a ghostly haze. Or maybe it was the strange way the lights flickered now and then, casting shadows that seemed to shift and grow in the corners of the room. Either way, a chill had settled over me that I couldn't quite shake, an uncomfortable sense that something was just off. I made my way down the dimly lit aisles, the rows of stacked crates looming around me like silent sentries. My flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam bouncing off metal and cardboard as I walked, trying to shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. It was just a quiet night shift, like any other, I reminded myself. Nothing to worry about. But as I reached the back of the warehouse, a new sound cut through the steady rhythm of the rain. A sharp, metallic groan, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen, wondering if I'd imagined it. The sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere nearby, just beyond the stacks of crates to my left. I took a step forward, my flashlight trembling in my grip as I swept it across the floor, trying to pinpoint the source. There was nothing unusual, no sign of movement, but the metallic groaning continued, echoing off the walls in a way that made it hard to tell where it was coming from. I felt a cold sweat prickling on my neck as I edged closer, each step feeling heavier than the last. Then I saw it. A door that should have been locked, slightly ajar, its hinges creaking softly as it swayed. My pulse quickened as I realized that door led to the far storage area, a place that was supposed to be completely secure. I approached it cautiously, reaching out to push it open wider, my mind racing with possible explanations. Maybe it was just a loose latch, I told myself. Maybe the wind had somehow forced it open. But as I pushed the door open, the sound of soft whispering drifted out from the darkness beyond, faint but unmistakable. It was a low, almost rhythmic murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. My stomach twisted, and I took an instinctive step back, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows. But the room behind me was empty, silent, save for the rain and the faint hum of the overhead lights. I turned back to the open doorway, the whispering growing louder, each word blending into the next, too soft to understand, but somehow filled with a quiet menace. I knew I should walk away, call for backup, do anything but stand there listening. But some part of me was drawn to the sound, compelled by a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. I took a cautious step forward, peering into the darkness, my flashlight barely piercing the shadows. Then I saw it, a glint of metal, a flash of movement. My breath caught as the glint of metal disappeared into the shadows, replaced by the dark outline of a figure crouched low behind a stack of boxes. The figure was still, but I could feel the weight of its presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the air with a dread that sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step back, my pulse thundering in my ears, as the whispering faded into silence, replaced by an almost tangible sense of danger. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, forcing myself to stay calm, though every instinct in me screamed to turn and run. But I couldn't just leave without knowing what or who was hiding in the warehouse. I took a deep breath and called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there? This is private property. You need to come out now." The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural, like the whole world had gone still, holding its breath. Then, just when I thought I might have imagined the figure, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, the shadow shifted, and I caught another flash of metal, a knife glinting in the faint light from my flashlight. My heart hammered as I took another step back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I realized, with a cold jolt of fear, that this wasn't some prank or misunderstanding. The figure crouched in the darkness wasn't hiding by accident. He was waiting, watching me with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I turned to reach for my radio, my fingers fumbling as I tried to call for help. "This is Frank, in the back storage area. I need backup, now," I whispered, trying to keep my voice low, afraid that even speaking too loudly might provoke the figure lurking just a few feet away. As I spoke, the figure shifted again, rising slowly from his crouch until he was standing fully upright. He was tall, his posture unnaturally rigid, with the knife held loosely at his side. For a brief, horrifying moment, our eyes met, and I could see nothing in his expression. No fear, no anger, just a cold, calculated stillness that made my blood run cold. Without breaking eye contact, he took a single step toward me, and I felt my resolve shatter. I turned and sprinted down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space as I ran, the fear coursing through me almost paralyzing. I didn't dare look back, convinced that if I did, I would see him just behind me, that gleaming knife ready to strike. I raced through the maze of crates and boxes, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the shadowed figure as possible. The rain outside seemed louder now, pounding against the metal roof, adding to the pounding of my heart and the thud of my boots against the concrete floor. I could barely hear myself think, my mind flooded with a primal, overwhelming need to escape. Finally, I reached the front security office, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the door, gasping for breath, my mind racing with fragments of what I'd seen. That knife, the blank expression, the way he just watched me, like I was nothing more than prey. I picked up the phone and dialed the police, my voice coming out as a shaky whisper as I explained the situation, giving them the address and everything I could remember about the figure in the warehouse. They promised to send someone over immediately, but even with the reassurance of help on the way, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the man's gaze was still fixed on me through the walls. I paced the small room, every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last, and with every passing second, my fear deepened, sinking its claws into me as I waited for the police to arrive. The minutes felt like hours as I stood in the small security office, my back pressed against the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every sound seemed amplified, the pounding rain, the hum of the fluorescent lights, even the soft creaks of the old warehouse settling ring. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. The glint of the knife, the blank, predatory stare, the way he just watched me like he was waiting for the exact moment to strike. Finally, red and blue lights cut through the rain outside, flashing against the warehouse walls. Relief washed over me as I saw the police cruiser pull up, 2 officers stepping out and heading toward the entrance. I opened the door cautiously, peeking out to wave them down, grateful to no longer be alone. The officers approached quickly, their expressions alert but calm. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, nodded to me. "You're Frank, right? The one who called it in?" I nodded, trying to steady my voice. "Yeah, he's still in there, I think. Back in the storage area. He has a knife, and I don't know what he's doing here, but something isn't right. I don't know how he got in." The other officer, a woman with a firm, reassuring look, placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll take it from here. Just stay back and keep the door locked, okay?" They headed into the warehouse, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they disappeared down the corridor toward the storage area. I stayed by the door, my heart still racing, listening to the muffled sounds of their footsteps fading into the distance. I kept waiting, tense and alert, hoping I'd soon hear them calling out to say they'd found him, that it was all over. But instead, a heavy silence settled over the building, thick and unnerving. I couldn't hear the officers' voices, and couldn't hear anything except the relentless beat of the rain. Minutes passed, and a creeping dread began to claw its way back into my chest. What was taking so long? Finally, I heard footsteps approaching, and I rushed to open the door, relief flooding me as the officers returned. They looked around the room, their faces pale and tense, eyes scanning the shadows as if they too felt something was deeply wrong. "We searched everywhere," the tall officer said, his voice low and steady, though I could sense the tension beneath it. "There's no one back there." I stared at him, disbelief making my voice shake. "No, he was there. I saw him. He had a knife. He was just standing there watching me." My mind raced, unable to accept the idea that they hadn't found him. "Did you check behind the crates? He was hiding." The officer nodded slowly. "We checked every inch of the area, Frank. If someone was in there, they're gone now." His words sank in, chilling me to the core. It didn't make sense. I'd seen him, felt the danger like a physical presence. How could he have disappeared so quickly, without a trace? The officer's calm stare met mine, and for a moment, I wondered if he believed me or if he thought it was just nerves, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, empty warehouse. They left soon after, promising to keep an eye on the area and report back if they found anything suspicious. I stood alone in the office, their departure leaving a cold emptiness that seeped into my bones. The warehouse was silent once more, the rain fading to a soft drizzle, and every shadow felt like it was holding secrets I didn't want to uncover. That night, I gathered my things, unable to shake the feeling that the man was still out there, waiting, watching. I locked up the warehouse one final time, knowing I couldn't come back. Whatever had happened, whatever that presence was, I knew it had left a mark on me, a reminder that some things simply aren't meant to be explained. I left my keys on the security desk and walked out, the memories of that night following me like shadows. And as I stepped into the rain, I knew that I was leaving more than just a job behind. I was leaving a piece of myself, a fear I would carry for the rest of my life, haunted by the sound of metal and the memory of eyes that would forever be watching. It was a chilly evening, and I was walking Max through the quiet streets around my apartment complex. This was our nightly ritual, one last stroll before bedtime to let him burn off any extra energy. I'd grown used to these familiar streets, the hum of traffic in the distance, the warm glow of lights spilling from apartment windows. It felt safe, predictable, almost comforting in its regularity. Max tugged at his leash, sniffing every blade of grass and lamppost we passed. I glanced up at my building, watching the way the streetlights cast shadows along the walls, making the structure look slightly eerie in the fading light. But it was home, my little haven in the middle of a bustling city, and I always felt a certain relief seeing my apartment window on the 4th floor, knowing a warm bed and a cozy night awaited. Tonight, though, something made me stop in my tracks. There, in the darkened window of my apartment, I thought I saw movement. It was just a flicker, a faint shift, like a shadow passing across the window. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light maybe, but as I squinted, I saw it again, a figure, silhouetted against the faint glow coming from the hallway light I'd left on. A cold chill washed over me. I was certain I'd left all the lights off except the hallway one, and yet there it was, someone standing inside my apartment. Max tugged on the leash again, oblivious, but my mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over themselves as I tried to make sense of it. I was sure I'd locked up, sure I'd been the last one there before stepping out. I shook myself out of my daze and quickened my pace, practically pulling Max along as I headed back toward the building. My heart pounded, and my palms felt clammy as I tried to keep my mind focused. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Maybe a neighbor had come by for some reason, though I couldn't imagine why. But deep down, I felt the prickling unease of something wrong, something that couldn't be rationalized away. Once inside, I hurried up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my pulse quickening with each step. The silence in the stairwell was oppressive, every sound amplified in the echoing space, heightening my sense of urgency. By the time I reached my floor, I was almost out of breath, but I forced myself to slow down, taking a steadying breath as I approached my apartment door. I unlocked it as quietly as possible, listening for any sounds inside. But all was silent, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock. I stepped inside, Max trotting beside me, his nails clicking softly against the floor. I glanced around, trying to spot anything out of place, but the living room looked exactly as I'd left it. My gaze drifted to the hallway that led to my bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible beyond. I froze, a creeping sense of dread curling in my stomach. There was no reason for that door to be open. I always kept it closed. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as if the entire apartment was holding its breath. I took a cautious step forward, every nerve on edge, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I left the door open by accident? Was there someone inside, or was it all just my imagination? Max seemed to sense my tension. His ears perked up, his eyes fixed on the darkened hallway. With each step, my heart pounded louder, drowning out the quiet of the apartment. The closer I got to the bedroom, the stronger the feeling became, a gnawing certainty that I wasn't alone. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the crack in the bedroom door. The silence felt suffocating, pressing down on me as I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to bolt, to leave the apartment and call for help from the safety of the hallway, but something inside urged me forward, compelled me to see for myself what was behind that door. Max whined softly beside me, his ears pinned back as he stared at the darkness beyond. I gave his leash a reassuring tug, though my hands were shaking. With a last, steadying breath, I stepped forward, reaching out to push the door open. It swung inward with a soft creak, revealing the dim interior of my bedroom. At first glance, everything looked normal. My bed, neatly made, my desk, cluttered with papers and an open laptop, clothes hanging neatly in the closet. But as I scanned the room, my eyes adjusted to the shadows, and that's when I saw it. A figure crouched in the far corner, half hidden in the darkness. A pair of eyes met mine, glinting faintly in the dim light, wide and unblinking. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was paralyzed, unable to process what I was seeing. He was just there, watching me in complete silence, his expression unreadable, almost animalistic in its intensity. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to get out, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The stranger's gaze was steady, almost calm, as though he'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for me to find him. My heart pounded, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady, not daring to break eye contact as I took a slow step backward. The man didn't move, didn't make a sound, just continued to stare, his expression a mask of quiet menace. In the dimness, I could make out little more than his outline, but I could feel the tension in the air with an almost palpable threat that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew I needed to act, to do something before he decided to close the distance between us. I took another step back, finally reaching into my pocket for my phone. With a quick, trembling motion, I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes on the figure in the corner. The seconds ticked by painfully, each one stretching longer than the last, as I waited for someone to answer. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, and I nearly sighed with relief. I kept my voice low, fighting to keep it steady. There's someone in my apartment. He's in my bedroom, and he's just standing there, watching me. The operator asked me to describe my location and the situation, and I relayed the details as calmly as I could, feeling a flicker of hope as she assured me officers were on their way. I could hear Max growling softly now, sensing the tension, his gaze locked on the stranger in the corner. The man's eyes shifted slightly, flicking toward Max for an instant before returning to me, his expression unreadable. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the sound of sirens, every second heightening the tension in the small room. I backed away further, inching toward the doorway, never taking my eyes off the intruder. His gaze followed me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine, but he remained still, almost eerily so, as if he knew there was nothing I could do to make him leave. Finally, I heard the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, followed by a firm knock on the door. I broke eye contact with the man for the first time, glancing back toward the living room, "The police are here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. When I looked back at the corner, the man's expression hadn't changed. He stayed in his crouched position, still and silent, as though my words hadn't fazed him in the slightest. The police officers entered swiftly, their flashlights slicing through the dimness of my apartment. I waved them toward the bedroom, stepping aside as one officer approached, his hand on his holstered weapon. Max barked, breaking the tense silence, and I reached down to hold his collar, trying to keep him calm as we both watched the officers move in. The lead officer stepped into the room, flashlight aimed into the corner where the stranger crouched. I couldn't see the man's face anymore, but I could feel his presence, could sense the oppressive weight of his gaze still somehow fixed on me. The officer's voice was calm but firm. "Sir, stand up and put your hands where I can see them." For a tense moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy, until finally the man slowly rose from his crouched position, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his hands, his expression still unreadable, his eyes never leaving mine, even as the officers took hold of his arms and led him toward the door. As he passed me in the hallway, his gaze remained locked on me, a quiet, unnerving intensity in his eyes that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. He didn't speak, didn't resist, just watched me with an almost unsettling calm as the officers guided him out of the apartment. I held Max close, feeling the tension drain from my body as the door finally closed behind them. The apartment was quiet once more, the echo of footsteps fading down the hall, leaving me alone in the silence. I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a deep, unsettling feeling that lingered, refusing to let go. An officer returned a few minutes later to take my statement, asking me to recount everything I'd seen, every detail. I told him about the figure in the window, about finding the stranger crouched in my room, about the eerie, unbroken stare. The officer listened intently, jotting down notes, his expression calm but sympathetic. "You're lucky you saw him when you did," he said softly. "If you hadn't come back early, who knows what he might have done?" The thought sent a chill through me, and I shuddered, unable to shake the feeling of those eyes on me. I asked if they knew how he'd gotten in, but the officer just shook his head. "We'll investigate further, but it's possible he was here for a while, maybe days. It's hard to say for certain." That revelation hit me harder than anything else. The idea that he could have been lurking in my apartment, watching me go about my life, undetected, left me feeling vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. I nodded numbly, trying to process the implications, to comprehend the violation of my personal space. When the officer finally left, closing the door softly behind him, I found myself alone in the quiet. The apartment felt different now, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension, holding on to it, a silent witness to everything that had happened. Max settled down at my feet, sensing my unease, his head resting on my lap as if trying to comfort me. But sleep was out of the question. Every creak, every shadow felt magnified, stirring a fresh jolt of anxiety. I found myself glancing around constantly, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me from the darkness, to feel the weight of that gaze once more. Even as dawn approached, the feeling didn't fade, lingering in the air like a haunting reminder of the night's events. I knew then that I could never look at my home the same way again. The safety, the sense of sanctuary I'd once felt here was shattered, replaced by a deep-rooted fear that I couldn't shake. The memory of that silent figure, hidden in the shadows of my own bedroom, watching, waiting, I knew it would stay with me, a scar left by a pair of eyes that had seen far too much.